Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Western Foundation's seminar series. People are going to be continuing to add on, so I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to our presentation for tonight and do a little bit of logistics. I wanted to let you know that in addition to myself, Linnea Hall, the Executive Director of the Western Foundation, we also have on as a panelist to kind of help with logistics, Jennifer Watson, our finances manager. We have Renee Corrado, our collections manager, and Mimi Damwick, our collections assistant in the wings, helping from the direction of the attendees. And we have Paul Grindrod, who you can see, I think, here on the screen, who's going to be giving the presentation tonight. Okay, so we're up to about 25 people, so I think I'll go ahead and start the presentation specifically. So welcome to the Western Foundation's webinar series, where we'll be talking about bird issues and environmental issues impacting birds and nature every month. We're going to go from an every other month format to every month. The webinars will be held the last Friday of every month, except holiday months, from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So as I mentioned, I'm Linnea Hall, the director. And the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology, for those of you who don't know, is a natural history museum dedicated to assisting with the conservation and study of the world's wild bird species. We have a physical museum located in Camarillo, California, which is closed to the public right now, but we do have a virtual presence through these webinars, through our website, through our Facebook and Instagram pages, and through our specimen collections portal, which allows you to access records for more than 300,000 historic bird specimens, especially eggs and nests that were collected all over the world from the early 1800s to the present, and have been used by researchers to study aspects of the ecology, taxonomy, and health of bird species. And the access to that collections portal is through our website. So the specimens that we have and that other museums have all over the world have played a role in recovering many bird species and have greatly contributed to our understanding of species. For example, for our museum in particular, we've helped assist with the recovery of the peregrine falcon, the brown pelican, and the bald eagle. And we continue to monitor the health and the causes of declines and impacts to bird species. And we hope that you'll take some time to learn more about what we do and consider joining us as a member. Again, if you go to our website, we have more information up there for you to read about us. So to the logistics of the talk for tonight, this is a Zoom webinar rather than a Zoom meeting. So for those of you who haven't participated in webinars before, you'll see that you're muted during the talk. I can unmute you at the very end for direct questions, but we'll just see how many people are on at that point. But in the meantime, to pose a question or to make a comment, please do so through the Q&A button or the chat button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be reviewing the comments throughout the presentation, and if any are particularly relevant to everyone, I will ask our speaker to pause and answer them during his talk. Otherwise, we will try to answer them in writing during the presentation, or we'll answer them at the end. If at any time your signal dies and Zoom kicks you out of the program, please just enter back in through the Zoom link that was sent to you. The same thing if you cannot hear the speaker or see his slides, try going out and re-entering using your link. Oftentimes that fixes the issue. So this brings me to our talk for this evening. Tonight we have one of our own staff giving a presentation about the perception of vultures in Western writings and art since the 1400s. The talk will be given by Mr. Paul Grindrod. As Paul will explain, the perception of vultures has changed a lot over the years, and this is reflected in works of art and writings about these birds. Paul, who is the Science Education Coordinator for the Western Foundation, has given another talk for us on this similar kind of subject, and particularly on the bald eagle. And this particular talk tonight promises to be equally interesting. As you read as you read in Paul's bio, he has a background in natural history interpretation with an emphasis on the humanities. I would like to say that perception, which Paul will be discussing tonight, is a tricky thing, isn't it? Many human cultures have been perceived in ways that have led to deep injustices and inconsolable tragedies. This is the root of the Black Lives Matter movement. It is thus critical that we constantly reevaluate our perceptions to make sure that we are not causing harm to our fellow human inhabitants on this planet. And now is always a good time to do this. In nature, organisms also have been tragically damaged through faulty perceptions. Think of all the spiders and snakes that have been killed, for example, because people perceive them as dangerous. Owls have also long been perceived as evil in some cultures, and many have been killed as a result. And so imagine now how birds that eat dead animals for a living have been perceived, and you will understand some of the talk for tonight. Tonight, I would like to say that our talk is collectively under the banner of, it's time to adjust all of our misperceptions. And with that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Paul Grindrod.
Thank you, Linnea, and amen. All right. When we travel southward along the Atlantic seaboard, soon after we cross an invisible line, the map would show us to be in the state of New Jersey. We begin to see from time to time dark spots high up in the sky. They seem stationary at first sight. Then as we watch, we see that they are moving, swinging often in wide circles. And then one of them comes near. We see it as a great dark bird sailing through the air. We have entered the domain of the turkey vulture, the chief avian scavenger of the United States, a big bird with long, broad wings, and a keen sense of sight and smell, and utilitarian as well as aesthetic, a plumage that does not show the dirt, and a naked head and neck like the bare arms of a butcher, a bird of prey, one of the raptors, but one that does not inflict death, but searches and watches and waits until it comes upon the dead, and then the feast begins. Our feast of vultures tonight begins with an image taken from a 14th century English bestiary, the Petersboro bestiary. Bestiaries were often didactic Christian texts that used allegories from the animal world to teach us about human behaviors. This particular bestiary described the vulture not only for its alleged ability to spot corpses at a great distance, and they are known to have very good eyesight. It also has an ability, this book said, to produce young without a mate. And so it was often used as a parallel to the story of the Immaculate Conception. Vultures are believed to foretell death. And some people believe that the birds would actually follow doomed armies into battle in the hopes of future meals. So we will explore these and several other facts and myths about vultures over the next hour or so. So welcome to International Vulture Awareness Day. It was actually September 5th this year. It's always the first Saturday in September, but it's time that we give these often reviled and misunderstood birds a little bit of a friendlier view. So let's look at the Feast of Vultures. From another bestiary, this one from the 1400 to about 1450, the Bestiarium of Anne Walsh, curiously written by a woman, which is not common in the Middle Ages. So when we talk about vultures, what are we really talking about? There are 23 species of birds worldwide that are categorized as vultures, but there's an important distinction. 16 of those species are Old World species, and we'll get to the other 7 in a few minutes, but the Old World vultures are in the family Accipitridae, the order Accipitriformes. They are reasonably closely related to hawks and eagles, the true hunting birds. They are exclusively visual hunters. They are known to not have a particularly acute sense of smell. The 16 species are the cinereous vulture, the griffon vulture, the white-rumped vulture, rupals, the Indian, slender-billed, Himalayan, white-backed, Cape, hooded, red-headed, lappet-faced, white-headed, bearded, Egyptian, and palm nut. So 16 species of Old World vultures. They tend to have broad wings, naked heads, fairly slow flyers. They are primarily carrion eaters. Some of them will, in fact, kill the sick and the weak of things and eat them. And one species, the bearded vulture, or also known as a lammergeier, actually prefers to eat the marrow out of bones. So it finds carcasses that have been picked clean by the other vultures, and it takes the bones and drops them on rocks to break them open, and it eats the contents of the bone. They occur in a number of bestiaries and another related set of books under the title of the Physiologus. It's a book by an anonymous Greek author. It was reprinted in multiple languages throughout the Middle Ages. And again, it's a didactic, an educational Christian text that has a lot of fact and myth, but it's also allegory about how humans should really behave, or how we should fit into the world. Amongst other things, it tells us that the word vulture is believed to have been created as a portmanteau, a combined word out of the Latin volatu tardu, which means to fly slowly. And it's very typical of these broad-winged, light-bodied birds, is that they flap and they fly very slowly. The Physiologus describes the bird's rapacity and acute eyesight. The writers believed that vultures could see cadavers deep in the sea. They retold the story that the female vulture could conceive on her own, again with parallels to the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. Pliny, the Roman natural historian, had told stories of vultures following armies and knowing in advance how many soldiers were likely to die in the fight. And other people spoke of vultures' other uncanny abilities to foretell death, hence the common scene in Western movies when you know that somebody's about to die because the vultures will start to circle over the top of them. Vultures appear in the Bible, and interestingly, they appear in earlier versions of the Bible as vultures. After the King James Version in English, a lot of the vulture quotes were changed to eagle, because eagles were perceived as much more noble and regal birds. But the quotes themselves don't make as much sense when you hear them in their original form. From Matthew 24:28, wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Likewise from Micah 1:16, shave your head in mourning for the children in whom you delight. Make yourself as bald as the vulture, for they will go from you into exile. It doesn't make as much sense if you use eagle instead of vulture. Eagles aren't bald. Shakespeare is known to have mentioned vultures at least once in King Lear. Lear is complaining of the meanness of one of his daughters, and he bitterly exclaims, "O Regan, she hath tied sharp-toothed unkindness like a vulture here." In modern times, we have cultural references to vultures as well, particularly in the Old World, to the Zoroastrian or the Parsi communities in India. The vulture is the gateway, the messenger to take a body's soul to heaven. And so it's important that you be consumed by a scavenging bird to liberate your spirit. The vultures in India are also, unfortunately, among some of the most endangered in the world. India has 9 species of wild vultures. 3 of those, the white-backed, the long-billed, and the slender-billed vultures, have shown population declines of up to as much as 99%. The culprit appearing to be a widely used veterinary pain-relieving drug called diclofenac. It's an aspirin-like or a non-steroid pain reliever, but it's used extensively in livestock, which are sacred in India, and so they tend to die of natural causes. When the vultures consume the carcasses, which is their important role, they in fact are highly susceptible to the toxicity of these drugs, and so it has decimated populations. Some of the partially scavenging eagle species, steppe eagles and tawny eagles, are also being affected, but not nearly as severely as the vultures seem to be. So now we're going to make a jump to the New World. The first reference to a vulture that I've been able to find in my research is from a 1729 to 1731 publication by an English natural historian named Mark Catesby. Wrote a book called The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, where he had an opportunity to travel. His sister was married to a functionary in Williamsburg, and so Catesby came over and traveled around Virginia and the Carolinas and put out one of the earliest natural history texts. So this was his rendition of a turkey vulture. This may be the start of what is going to be an ongoing theme throughout this when we talk about particularly turkey vultures, but the New World vultures being called buzzards. And so here you see in his description, Catesby called this a turkey buzzard. The buzzards are the Beauty-and-Eye hawks, the red tail like hawks in the old world. And it was Linnaeus who named the vultures. And so the name vulture was known in Europe. How Catesby came to confuse this with a Beauty-and-Eye hawk is an open question, but colloquially in a lot of the US, turkey vultures are still known as turkey buzzards, and this is probably why. Excuse me. So New World vultures, there are 7 additional vulture species. They are completely unrelated or only distantly related to the Old World vultures. They were historically put in the same order. They have at various times been put into an order with storks and herons. They were in the Saconiformes for a while, based on some early DNA evidence that has since been refuted. So they've been kicked around a little bit. They are currently sitting in their own order, in their own family, the Cathartidae. They're known as vultures or condors. We have one condor species here and one in South America. They're not related very closely to the Old World vultures, although they share some very similar characteristics, which is now considered to be a really clear example of convergent evolution. They live the same lifestyle. They're largely scavengers. And so they have evolved over time the same tools to do the same job, but they got to that set of tools from apparently quite different places. So the New World species are the black vulture, the turkey vulture, the lesser and greater yellow-headed vultures in South America, the California condor, the Andean condor, and the king vulture. And we'll get to see a few of these species in some of the later illustrations. Just a little bit of a modern update. The California condor, which is a species that the Western Foundation has been intimately involved in the recovery and restoration efforts of. In the latest report that came out from the condor recovery effort, which reported through the 2019 breeding season, the 2020 data isn't available yet because between coronavirus upsetting the field research schedule and the fires making it difficult to get into some of the nesting areas, the data is likely not even completely gathered yet. But as of the most recent complete report, the end of 2019, from a low of 22 birds in the mid-1980s, there are now 518 California condors alive in the world. 337 of those free-flying birds in 4 separate populations, and 181 kept in captivity for breeding purposes. So tremendous success story in terms of recovery for the California condor, and we'll see more of them as we go along. So this image we're looking at slightly, well, almost 100 years after Catesby first illustrated the turkey vulture that we saw in the previous picture. This from a book called The Natural History of Birds of North America. One of the earliest treatises of strictly the avian species here, printed in France. You'll notice that he is using, well, he's a French author, and so it is in French, le vautour, which is the French form of vulture. For a scientific name, he's using Linnaeus's vultur, V-U-L-T-U-R, and aura is the specific. And the aura will be persistent, we'll see as we go through the nomenclatural changes over time. But the genus name is gonna change around a little bit as we move forward. The next major work on American birds came out in 1814. It's by Alexander Wilson. Wilson was a Scotsman, emigrated to the US, and put out a book called The American Ornithology, or the Natural History of the Birds of the United States. He's often considered kind of the father or the grandfather of, if you will, of American formal ornithology. He's still using Linnaeus's terminology for the bird. It's still called vultur, and he drew it along with a black vulture, which is in a different genus but the same family. A bird that you'll find all over the southeastern United States, occasionally as far west as Arizona, West Texas. And we get to see one of the earliest images of the two birds side to side, and then a detail of just the turkey vulture on the right. He's also still using buzzard after Catesby. 1821, an English work, A General History of Birds by John Latham. I'd say it's pretty safe to assume that this gentleman never saw the bird live. He's working from a study skin. It's a surprisingly, I don't like to say inept, but it's a surprisingly inaccurate drawing given the quality of some of the other illustrations that were already being done of this species at this time. 1825, we have another French book, The Gallery of Birds. This is also by Jean-Louis Pierre Villot, who did the 1807 natural history picture that we saw a couple of slides back. Villot did this a lot. He did multiple versions of his pictures. He would change a little bit in the background. In this case, he's put it perched on a branch instead of on a log, instead of on a stone, I'm sorry. But the bird is essentially unchanged. 1835, we have what's essentially a reissue of Wilson's American Ornithology, but it's completely re-illustrated by a gentleman named Thomas Brown. He essentially imitates the poses that Wilson used in his, but often features the birds a little bit closer up and changes the backgrounds, but it's not a substantial variation from what Wilson had shown. It's a surprisingly accurate rendition of the head of the bird, suggesting that he did have access to either live birds or to study skins that he could work from. (1834 to 1837). This is a multi-volume text that came out of The Animal Kingdom Arranged According to Its Organization. This is by Baron Georges Cuvier. He's a noted French anatomist and natural historian. Amongst other things, Cuvier was one of the first people to believe and to argue that fossils were actually the remains of extinct animals. What we see in his illustration that's interesting is we are still 20 to 30 years before the publication of The Origin of Species, and evolution is not a widely accepted idea. And so the belief was common then that vultures were all commonly related based on their similar morphology. Convergent evolution wasn't understood because evolution itself wasn't understood. So Cuvier, in illustrating the vultures, tends to give us sort of a mixed bag here. We have two Old World vultures and two New World vultures illustrated in full color on a page. And then the turkey vulture in this particular case is relegated just to the sketch of the head, which I've blown up and put in here as an inset. But otherwise, he shows us the Andean condor, the Indian vulture, the king vulture, and the bearded vulture or lammergeier. So we have Old World in the top left and bottom right, and New World in the top right and bottom left. (1840 to 1844) is the time when John James Audubon is illustrating and publishing his massive volume, Birds of North America. So here we have Audubon's rendition of the adult and juvenile turkey vulture. The adult has the red head. The juvenile looks very much like an adult, but with a gray or black head. Excuse me. So Audubon, in writing about vultures, famously argued that they did not have a sense of smell. He did a series of experiments where he hid food under things, and because the vultures couldn't get to the food, he determined that they couldn't smell it, that they had to see it. That was argued even at the time, but he found an ally in another early American ornithologist and naturalist named John Bachman, who became sort of Audubon's champion in this, and did his own set of experiments and wrote, "It has been the long established belief of all civilized nations since the time of the Romans that vultures were possessed of extraordinary olfactory powers by which they were enabled to scent their food at the distance of many miles. All the writers on American ornithology have ascribed to the vultures of the United States the same extraordinary powers of smell, with the single exception of Mr. Audubon, who in a paper published in Jameson's Journal in Edinburgh in 1826, detailed a series of experiments made in America from which he came to the conclusion that these birds were guided to their food altogether by the eye." So Bachman himself undertakes another series of experiments, which he doesn't describe in much detail, so it's hard to tell what he was going by, but he also determined, to the best of his abilities, that turkey vultures were only finding their food by sight, which prompted one of his detractors to quip that he would fully expect to see vultures attacking the signs advertising every meat shop in Charleston, South Carolina, because apparently, amongst other things, Bachman showed vultures pictures of dissected animals and said that they tried to pick at the pictures to eat the flesh. What was likely really going on there is that vultures are extremely curious animals, and since these were clearly animals in some sort of captivity, they were probably just fascinated with the book. There's more detail about this if you want to read about it in a book that came out a few years ago called The Thing with Feathers by Noah Stryker, and in a chapter titled The Buzzard's Nostril, he goes into quite a bit of the history behind the Audubon, Bachman, and sense of smell debates going on in American natural history. 1844, just about the end of the time that Audubon's finishing up his work, we have James E. Decay puts out the Zoology of New York, or the New York Fauna. And again, a fairly accurate rendition of a turkey vulture, still going in his common nomenclature as a turkey buzzard. Another French work, this one from a man named Alcide Dessalines d'Orbigny, was a naturalist who went on a voyage to Central and Southern America, and this was his illustration of the turkey vultures there. Turkey vultures are the most widely distributed of the three New World vultures that appear in North America. Turkey vultures actually go all the way down to Patagonia in South America and as far north, at least in the summertime, as southern Canada. So they span actually both continents of the Americas. And d'Orbigny here also illustrated side by side the black vulture and the turkey vulture, and the eggs of both as well. 1873, a volume not Audubon's Birds of North America, a different book called The Birds of North America. This one by an illustrator named Theodore Jasper. And this is the first illustration where we get to see all three North American vulture species side by side. So we've got a condor at the top, black vulture in the middle, and the turkey vulture represented at the bottom. In 1874, the British Museum puts out a catalog of the birds in its collection with illustrations by a very well-known Dutch scientific illustrator at the time. His name is John Gerard Keulemans, and Keulemans chose to illustrate the turkey vulture, the most widespread species and the one common here, with one of its congeners in South America, the lesser yellow-headed vulture. So we get to see yet another New World vulture species in comparison with the turkey vulture. In a sketch that may have been done as early as 1840 for the original volume, but was reprinted in 1891, this is Thomas Nuttall's A Popular Handbook of the Birds of the United States and Canada, redone in 1891 by Montague Chamberlain. But it's a really nicely detailed, although black and white, illustration of a turkey vulture, and well enough done that it is recognizably distinct from a black vulture. So about the time that that book came out, another volume came out by a guy named William Watson Woolen. This is 1907, this edition. While William Shakespeare did mention vultures, he never wrote a sonnet about them. Woolen apparently thought that that was a problem, and so he sought to make up the difference in his book, The Birds of Buzzard's Roost. And so he has a poem called The Turkey Vulture. Among the crags in cavernous deep, the vulture rears his brood, far-reaching in his vision's sweep, o'er valley, plain, and wood. And wheresoe'er the quarry lies, it cannot escape his peering eyes. The traveler from the plain below sees first a speck upon the sky, then poised on sweeping wings of woe, a vulture bat-like passes by. Seems to disparage both bats and vultures to a certain degree. Again, as Linnea discussed at the beginning, these perceptions that we often bring based on just our Western cultural history, that these are birds of ill omen and birds of despair because they are so commonly associated with death. This is from a book by Charles Robert Knight called The Birds of the World for Young People. Again, although it's black and white, this is actually a rendition of a turkey vulture. In 1921, we have The Book of Birds, Common Birds of Town and Country, and American Game Birds by Henry Henshaw, illustrated by perhaps the greatest of the early, late 19th, early 20th century ornithological illustrators. He was a man named Louis Agassiz Fuertes. He did a lot of publication, a lot of illustrations for National Geographic magazine. He was particularly fond of the birds of prey, but he illustrated a variety of birds. His work became very widely known because the Arm & Hammer Company for a number of years put out trading cards with illustrations of his birds. And so if you were a child obsessed with birds or learning your birds, you badgered your mother to buy Arm & Hammer baking soda so you could collect the Fuertes cards. Very much in the style of Fuertes, we have an image from a National Audubon Society publication by T. Gilbert Pearson, this one called Portraits and Habits of Our Birds. I haven't been able to learn much about Bruce Horsfall, the particular artist here. He did several of the paintings in this book, but I haven't really learned very much more about him. I don't often have photographs of these, but this one caught my eye just because it's so peculiar. So this is the only documentation of this. It was from a German documentary film. It's dated June of 1928. At about the same time that this came out, and what these people were here to film, I don't know. But again, this shows the inherent curiosity of turkey vultures. Perhaps this was a tamed or a trained one that was being used for the filming, but somebody caught a picture of it. So, you know, that's the only documentation we have. So in 1928, some interesting things going on in the world. There's a Pennsylvania-based ornithologist named George Sutton is writing in the Auk magazine in an article called "The Extension of the Breeding Range of the Turkey Vulture in Pennsylvania," is responding to an earlier paper that had come out that proposed that turkey vultures were known to be appearing further and further north. That's alluded to in the Arthur Cleveland Bent quote that I opened with, where when you hit a line about the middle of New Jersey, you'll start seeing turkey vultures. They rarely used to occur north of the Mason-Dixon line, the northern edge of Maryland. But the first theory put forth for why turkey vultures were showing up farther north was simply that it was sort of the last stages of post-glacial evolution, that all of these southern species, they mentioned the red-cockaded woodpecker, the Carolina wren, the turkey vulture, several others, were moving further and further north. And so the original speculation was that in the 10,000 years since the end of the last glaciation, as things were warming up, things were still kind of rebounding north. Sutton comes along in 28 and says, no, he doesn't think that it's that at all. And it's interesting because he actually refers to it as a change of climate. He does not believe that it's some change of the climate. It's actually an increase in the number of white-tailed deer. There's more food, and so the vultures are moving north. But in a more recent rebuttal of Sutton's theory, studies have been done on the dietary preferences of vultures, and they eat a lot of other things far more frequently, typically looking at stomach contents, than deer. And so it didn't really make sense to the authors that the turkey vultures were kind of sitting around waiting for deer to move north, since they don't really even like them that much, when there was plenty of other food that they could have eaten. But it does get into then this sort of this interesting talk about, well, could it be climate change? And of course, today, modern climate theory is proposing that indeed things are warming. We know that all kinds of species are expanding their ranges northward. And so the turkey vulture is probably just one of the earlier species to be able to take advantage of that. The other thing that crops up in what Sutton writes that will be pertinent to both what's about to come and some things that we said earlier is that he says the turkey vulture has for decades been known as a summer resident of the southern counties of Pennsylvania. It is particularly common around Gettysburg. Now, if we think back to what Pliny and some of the bestiary authors wrote about turkey vultures following doomed armies, being able to foretell death, and things like that, what do you suppose happened at Gettysburg at some point that might have been appealing to turkey vultures? And that leads me into another piece of fiction that I would like to share. It requires a little bit of background. So this is kind of a bridging scene. It doesn't have a lot to do with actually furthering the storyline, but it's a particularly, I think, interesting piece of writing because it invokes so much about vultures, and it gets so much right and it gets so much equally wrong, but it does it so nicely. So just a little background. This is from a novel that came out probably 15, 20 years ago now, called Wolf Whistle. It's by a white Southern writer named Lewis Norden. It is something of a fictionalization of the murder in the 1950s of Emmett Till. He was a young teenager. I believe he was 14 or 15 years old. An African-American boy was visiting relatives in the South and was accused of having made untoward advances towards a white woman, and some local people took the law into their own hands, and he was beaten horribly and eventually murdered. And Norden, the author of this book, had been a child or a young man at that time, and this was his way of dealing with that episode in his life when he grew up and became a writer, as he wrote a fictionalized account.
Paul, may I interrupt you for just one moment?
You may, sure.
Yep. So is this something that we should warn people about a little bit if they might find this uncomfortable?
No, I don't think so. That's the beauty of this. As horrific a subject as the book is based on, it is a work of fiction, and it doesn't go into the sort of graphic detail. And so,
okay.
No, I don't think there's anything here that should be particularly upsetting.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, but thank you for asking. So there are going to be some place names mentioned, Balancedue and the Belgian Congo. In the course of the story, these are explained, but this is the Jim Crow South. Things are segregated. They're in a small town called Arrowcatcher, but even within that town, there's a poor white neighborhood and a poor black neighborhood, and so those are referred to by their respective names. The main character who will be mentioned here is Solon Gregg, and there's a little local railroad that goes by that will be mentioned called the Katie and the Dog. So when you hear these sort of vague references, that's what they refer to. So Solon has just gotten out of prison after, I believe, a drinking binge, and he's walking home to his house in the poor white part of town. On top of each light post, high above the street, perched a buzzard, many buzzards, one right after another, post by post, down the road as far as you could see to the railroad tracks. An enormous flock that slept at night in a cypress swamp not far away and came out to sit on posts with heavy-lidded eyes by the day. The big birds were slick and black with rainwater, where they sat with hunched shoulders and wattled necks like sad old men in dark coats. The locals called them swamp eagles, or sometimes just eagles, though they were clearly buzzards. The birds were descendants and remnants of an ancient flock, attracted here long ago by the corpse stench of a Civil War battle when Balancedue and the Belgian Congo were only a big field, a significant Mississippi defeat. Cannon shells and belt buckles and maybe a finger joint still turned up from time to time in the muddy street after a hard rain. These birds were part of the glorious history of the South. They were written up now and then in local newspapers and in newspapers all across the state of Mississippi. Photographs taken almost 100 years ago by anonymous photographers with big, boxy, explosive cameras and tripods and black drapery over the photographer's head, and recent photographs as well, some in color, stood behind glass in display cases in the old Capitol Museum in Jackson. Historians studied the century-old photographs and even named the birds in the flock. School children from all around every county of this sovereign state, as it was always referred to in political speeches, visited the museum in Jackson and even visited this dangerous street in Arrowcatcher on field trips to view the historical vultures, to learn something of their solitary nature, their weight and length, their wingspan, their reproductive cycle, their incredible longevity. Some of the birds on the light post beneath which Solon Gregg trod on his way home were as ancient as the historical battle itself, older, 90, 100 years old, a few of them. So historians and ornithologists reported. And so as part of this same flock, those birds on the light posts above Solon Greg had actually fed on the flesh and eyes and tongues and nutritious organ meats of Confederate troops, fallen, hungry, frightened boys before they were made buzzard bait by a mini ball or cannon shot. Historical experts identified with some certainty several of the very birds in those early photographs. They pointed to dim details of broken and rehealed wings or unusual posture or mutations of feathering. They looked through binoculars, or they even drugged and carried individual birds away to scientific laboratories in Jackson and Biloxi and spread them out on stainless steel tables and poked at them and said, "See the similarities between this bird and bird Vardaman in photograph 17A, upper right quadrant, grid number 36? It's him, all right." The buzzards were named Vardaman and Bilbo and Hugh White and J.P. Coleman and Ross Barnett and other names of past and future governors and senators of the sovereign state of Mississippi. Other birds on the light posts, youthful by comparison, possessed only blood memories of the ancient feast, genetic egg yolk longings for distant, unremembered culinary ecstasy and freedom from deprivation, and sat with hope in their bird hearts and nothing at all in their bird brains. For many years, decades really, a human lifetime and longer, above the homes of damaged rednecks and maniacs with pistols, on smelly light posts planted in stinking mud, whiling away all of their valuable, irretrievable daylight hours and years in the sad innocence of poultry patience during this lean century since the glorious festival of dead rebels long ago, and they were content for now with roadkill. The vulture named Ross Barnett, ancient and ugly, had excellent eyesight. Far away in the distance, at the lucky spot on the rails where the Katy crossed the dog, Ross Barnett espied an armadillo not moving. Ross Barnett closed in prayer his heavy-lidded buzzard eyes and sucked swamp air inside his lungs to savor the fragrance of loss. Where had they come from, the tribe of armadillo, this gift, this manna, this perfection of the South, sweeter than turtles? Ross Barnett didn't like to be greedy. He was as good-natured and open-minded and as willing to share the riches of Mississippi as the next old buzzard. But with an armadillo, well, no, he didn't think so. He thought maybe it would be best for all concerned, best for the flock, really, not to do that, not just now. And it wasn't entirely selfish either. It was just a better idea for him to head on over towards the cypress swamp as if he were calling it a day. And then when the others were settled in, sucking in swamp poisons with their sleepy vulture snores, he'd circle back around to the cross tracks of the Katy and the dog and discover just what sweet surprise the little armorback Delta dumpling had hidden away from him deep inside the shell. So, what did he get right and what did he get wrong about vultures? It very much taps into our cultural sense of vultures as, dirty and sort of scary and harbingers of death. It describes their eyesight, which is known to be very good. I also like the line where it says that the vulture savors the fragrance of loss. So Bachman and Audubon argued that vultures didn't have a sense of smell. It has, in fact, since been proven that they do a variety of ways. They have a highly developed olfactory lobe in their brains, and the other animals that have a highly developed olfactory lobe, it's because they have a good sense of smell, so it's presumed from that they have a sense of smell. It has also been demonstrated that they can detect the odor of decay, that fragrance of loss, at a handful of parts per billion. So they have highly, highly receptive smell to the odor of decaying flesh. And what does that smell like? Well, for better or worse, we are all familiar with it, because when you smell a natural gas leak, you smell what turkey vultures smell in their food. It's a gas called mercaptan. It is given off by decaying flesh. It doesn't occur naturally in natural gas. That smell is put in there so we can detect gas leaks. That's because of an episode in 1937 in a small town in Texas called New London, which had tapped into the natural gas that was off-gassing from the local oil fields to heat their school. The gas didn't have any odor. They didn't realize there was a gas leak that had filled the building, and when somebody went to start some kind of a tool that sparked, it blew the school up. It killed several hundred people, and that caused the state of Texas to pass a law, which has since been passed nationally, that you have to have an odorant put into natural gas so that if there's a leak, people will detect it. They chose this gas mercaptan because humans are also highly sensitive to it, perhaps evolutionarily, so that we avoid decay and the germs that would be associated with that. So we also detect mercaptan at a very low rate. So they don't have to put very much of it into natural gas, and we smell it. Another interesting link to turkey vultures and that smell is that an ornithologist who was working for the Union Oil Company is one of the first people to have reported on a phenomenon that several of his company workers noticed, was that turkey vultures seemed to favor flying along their pipelines, and they couldn't figure out why. And when they started looking into it, it turned out that when you're piping natural gas and there's a leak, the turkey vultures smell the mercaptan that's been put into the natural gas. Excuse me. And congregate there, and so you'll know that you've got a gas leak there. So it's just another one of the ecological services that turkey vultures provide for us, in addition to cleaning up carcasses, taking care of things like anthrax and cholera and these diseases that kill wildlife that would affect us if they were left laying around. Turkey vultures can eat them and not be harmed. So another thing they do for us. So what else? Longevity is an interesting part of this piece in this excerpt from Wolf Whistle. In point of fact, there is not a lot known about longevity in turkey vultures. It's extremely unlikely that they live for 100 years. That would be most unusual. There's very little data, because when bird banding first started being practiced widely, just after about 1900 to 1920-ish, kind of the early years. Originally, people were putting bands in turkey vultures, but very shortly after, when they recovered turkey vultures, they started finding turkey vultures with badly damaged legs, or with a foot missing completely on a leg that had been banded. And what they discovered is that the bands that they put on, you always put them on so that they're loose enough that they can rotate and move around. They shouldn't pinch on the leg, but they have to be small enough they can't fall off over the foot. But turkey vultures do something called urohydrosis. They self-cool, and they also perhaps self-disinfect by excreting their own bodily waste onto their legs. And that's fine if there are no restrictions on the legs, but when you put an aluminum band on a leg and then they get those excretions on it, it would build up under the band and cause infection. And so very early on, turkey vultures were excluded from the list of birds that could be legally banded. So if you go, for example, to the bird banding laboratory site where they have longevity records, the record longevity on a banded turkey vulture is something only in the order of 15 or 16 years. It's because they stopped doing it so early on. In captivity, they have been known to live for as much as 30 to 33 years. There may be some that are slightly longer lived, but it's highly unlikely that turkey vultures live much past 40 years. So the whole story here of this historic flock of birds that had been there when the Civil War ended obviously can't be true. But it does do a lovely job of evoking this sort of sense of Southern Gothic by using turkey vultures. And our final picture here is by kind of largely a contemporary of Louis Agassiz Fuertes. This is a Canadian artist named Alan Brooks. Fuertes died in an accident quite young, and Brooks essentially inherited the mantle of the greatest living illustrator, at least in North America, of birds in the 30s. So this is his rendition of the turkey vulture. And there's a lovely poem by a California poet, a man named Robinson Jeffers. This came out in 1954, simply called Vulture. I had walked since dawn and lay down to rest on a bare hillside above the ocean. I saw through half-shut eyelids a vulture wheeling high up in heaven, and presently it passed again, but lower and nearer, its orbit narrowing. I understood then that I was under inspection. I lay death still and heard the flight feathers whistle above me and make their circle and come nearer. I could see the naked red head between the great wings, bared downward, staring. I said, "My dear bird, we're wasting time here. These old bones will still work. They are not for you." But how beautiful he looked, gliding down on those great sails. How beautiful he looked, veering away in the sea light over the precipice. I tell you solemnly that I was sorry to have disappointed him. To be eaten by that beak and become part of him, to share those wings and those eyes. What a sublime end to one's body. What an enskyment. What a life after death. So that is all of the pictures I have to share. I have a list of additional readings if you are interested in digging deeper into vultures yourself, learning more about them. There is a book by George David Haskell called The Forest Unseen. Came out, I believe, in 2012, and there's a chapter there called Vulture. Vultures Riding North, an article in Living Bird magazine. The Thing with Feathers, I mentioned, by Noah Stryker, has the chapter on the buzzard's nostril. The Bedside Book of Birds by, let's see, Graham, got his name here, Graham Gibson, is a really interesting compendium of all kinds of historical stuff. It actually was the source of that opening slide, the Petersburg bestiary, the vulture with the foot dangling out of its mouth, I first saw in the Bedside Book of Birds. April Pulley-Sayre is a children's book author, has done a kid's book called Vulture View. If you have kids and you want to share the joys and beauties of vultures, that's a good one. Just a couple of years ago, Katie Fallon, she's a woman in West Virginia, put out an entire book called Vulture, The Private Life of an Unloved Bird. A collection of essays by Lisa Couturier, The Hopes of Snakes and Other Tales from an Urban Landscape, has an essay on turkey vultures, and you can usually find online an essay by a woman named Leah Purpura called On Coming Back as a Buzzard. And again, there's that confusion between what's a vulture and what's a buzzard. It will turn up in common usage over and over again, but we don't hold that against them. So I thank you for your interest, and I'm happy to answer any questions, both about the artwork or about the readings, anything folks would like to talk about.
Okay, Paul, so if I'm going to take the screen sharing back over from you for a moment.
Okay.
And we'll go to this kind of a view. So if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. And then you can just ask the question directly. Sorry, Paul.
Excuse me.
If anybody has a question in particular about vulture biology or questions about the historical information that Paul presented, you know, any perceptions that you might have of vultures that you perhaps either had corrected tonight or had adjusted tonight, or that where you still feel like, you know, since they are decomposers of dead animals and organisms, you still don't
I
particularly
think they're
care for
terrible.
them?
And actually, while people are mulling that, something that we had talked about bringing up, and I neglected to do, but I should mention. So I pretty deliberately have stayed away from Native American cultural traditions with these. There are lots of them out there, and I did talk about the sky burials with the Parsi, the Zoroastrians, which are not occurring now because the vulture populations have been so horribly done in India. But some of the plains tribes in North America did sky burials. The Chumash locally, I know, had a very intimate relationship with the California condor. I have stayed away from trying to share too many of those stories, in part because in researching for this, those stories tended to be brought to popular awareness by white anthropologists, and I found a couple of sources that said that they actually got quite a bit of it wrong, from simple things like simply mistranscribing words so that they have been passed down historically but spelled wrong, which is somewhat minor, but it shows that it really isn't, I didn't feel it was my place as a non-native to delve too deeply into native. I want to certainly put it out there. I'm aware that they're there, and those are very important stories. I also think it's important that those stories be told by the people to whom they're relevant if they wish to share them. It's not my place to ferret those out and throw out potentially incorrect views. So if there's anybody who has insights, particularly into some native ideas about vultures, I would be thrilled and happy to hear those if you would like to share them.
Yeah, we would love to have another presentation on that subject, or a seminar, perhaps, I mean, a class perhaps. That would just be wonderful. So there's one question, Paul, from Angela. Can you speak about or is there a role that vultures have in disease control? But
there is, absolutely.
You know that there is, if you would speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, so vultures are known to have extremely acidic digestive tracts. And one of the theories for why they evolved that is that it's an incredibly inhospitable environment for all kinds of things. So they are known to be able to consume things like anthrax, cholera, you know, these diseases that you would typically find in free-roaming wildlife, which are zoonotic diseases. Humans are susceptible to them, and so by having,
as we know now.
Yes, as we, yeah,
unfortunately,
as we know, yeah, I'd be curious if maybe that's the antidote to coronavirus, is to just have more vultures. Maybe they can eat it all up. I don't know. No, this had long been speculated, but it has actually been looked at, a number of times. And so yes, what goes into turkey vultures can be, quite polluted for what a human could tolerate, and what comes out is essentially close to sterile. Interestingly, just an anecdote about that: when I worked for a couple of years at a raptor migration banding site out on the Utah-Nevada border, and there's a local wildlife rehabber in Elko, Nevada, who we worked with if we had injured birds. And she had been working with all kinds of raptorial species for years and years and years. And one of her kids, I believe, won her local and possibly her state science fair one year, because if your mom's a wildlife rehabilitator, you've got access to all kinds of cool science fair experiments that the other kids don't have access to. And so one year she would culture various bacteria and things on food before it was fed to their turkey vultures that were in captivity while they were being treated for things. And then she would take their excrement and culture that. And at a very basic, high school science fair level, she found that what went into the turkey vulture could be very, very germ-ridden, and what came out was essentially sterile in terms of anything that could hurt us. So, that's that's a reasonably imprecise anecdote, but people have, there's a lot of legitimate hard science out there that yes, they do in fact have an extremely important role to play in cleaning up, you know, potentially rotting carcasses. And I believe that I found in the most recent research that I did, you know, pulling this together for this presentation, I didn't look as hard at it, but I think that there has been some evidence in India and Nepal where the vulture populations have been so badly reduced that in addition to the cultural effects that it's having on the Zoroastrian community, for example, not being able to do their sky burials anymore, there has actually been a noticeable increase in public health issues for carcasses not being cleaned up. When you wipe out 99% of your scavenging, you know, vulture species, that's a lot of dead stuff not being eaten. And so there have been, I think, measurable public health ramifications from that. I'm sure that you could find information about that online.
Well, that kind of gets to this next question then. And by the way, thank you, Angela, for your question. But this next comment and question is from Hannah. And she said, well, I've always thought that bearded vultures are really beautiful. I made artwork in school for them. They're one of the only vultures I've seen with plumage on their heads. However, other vultures, I never really thought about them. And I would like to know more about how they affect their ecosystems. And so, you know, I think that goes to your point, Paul, of, you know, how important they are as trash disposers and as decomposers as well, as part of that cycle, and as the role of disease prevention too in many cases.
Right. Yeah, disease prevention, just general cleanup. The smelling gas leaks, I mean, that's a minor one, but who knew? But, you know, turkey vultures can actually help you find gas leaks in your natural gas pipelines. Yeah, in terms of other effects, you would probably need to look. I would guess that would vary from species to species, and I'm not nearly as familiar with the 16 old world species, and so it would require a depth of research, you know, vastly more than I've had time to put in for this to see what each one's role. But just as an overarching thing, I think they're scavenging and cleaning up and you know, helping to keep disease in check is probably really the major one.
So, you know, all of these organisms, as many people know who are on tonight, all of these organisms who are essentially decomposing organisms or decomposers, who make up that group of species, are vitally important to break down dead tissue so that it's available in the soil, can be broken down to its constituent parts, to its base molecules and atoms, so that it's available for other purposes, you know, for plants to take up and other organisms in the soil and elsewhere to take up. So I think, you know, in general, again, going back to the whole point of perceptions of how we tend to perceive decomposers as icky and as doing something that is, you know, a little off-putting to us, and yet it's vital. And so if we, you know, as part of our task as humans to change our perceptions, you know, which is so important that we update our perceptions in regards to other humans on this planet. But if we're going to also update our perceptions about the environment, one of those shifts that needs to happen is that we realize that there are these important roles that are played always by organisms that may not be cute or pretty to us, and that doesn't make them any less valuable. So I think that's something that's, you know, pretty important, and that I was hoping could come out of this conversation about vultures. I did want to say, Paul, you do have an interesting vulture sitting over your shoulder. So perhaps you could just say something about that particular picture.
Yeah, well, yeah, so this particular vulture is the Californian vulture, according to the name given it by the artist. This is John James Audubon, so that 1840 to 1844 period when he was doing the Birds of America. That's the California condor. And yeah, I'm trying to see how much of it you can see, because
You can see the whole
see
thing.
the whole thing. Okay. Yeah. And for what it's worth, I have started collecting historical images of these. So at some point in the future, I may be able to do a similar, provided I can find the literary references to condors, we'll see. But yeah, that's the
That'll be a
California
fun one.
condor. That's our local, well, one
A
of our
local
two
giant
local ones,
vulture.
because we have plenty of turkey vultures here as well.
Okay, so there are another couple of questions. One is actually from Rene Corrado. He said, my child asked me this question a long time ago. Do vultures eat vulture carcasses, as far as you know? And that's not something I've ever observed, but I wonder, Paul, if you have ever come across that.
I have never observed that. That's one I haven't seen it referenced. Given their taste in other things, I can't honestly say why they wouldn't, but I don't know that I've ever heard it. I'm gonna have to dig around in the literature and see if I can find a reference to that or not.
Yeah,
Nobody
I don't
in
know about
anything that
that
I've read so far has talked about that, but that's a
We'll have to look into that one, Renee, and get back to you.
yeah, not that's a mirror reflecting itself question. That one kind of makes my head, whoa, vultures eating vultures. I don't know.
You know, but are they the ultimate decomposer, that they would even decompose their own kind? You know, it's a good question. There was a comment from Cynthia Sorensen saying, not a question, but I saw a turkey vulture last week sitting on top of a telephone pole near my house, and it had quite a beautiful wingspan. And I would say, I know for myself, I just think they're really beautiful birds. So those of you who haven't watched them much, maybe this presentation tonight will encourage you to get out and do a little turkey vulture watching. By the way, they're on migration, or just getting ready to start their migration. So you might be seeing them in larger numbers than we had over the summer, as some move through or move into our area. But Paul, I'm sure you consider them quite lovely to watch also.
I do, yeah, and several people, talk about the gracefulness of their flight. Even the people who in some of this early ornithological literature who think that they're grim and they're bleak and but whenever they start talking about how they fly, yeah, everybody waxes eloquently about how they can soar for hours without flapping. I mean, they're perfectly designed to just sort of waft around up there, and so it's a very calming, peaceful, style of flight.
Yeah, truly. All right. Well, Paul, did you have any other
Well, just talking about seeing a lot of them, a great place to see them for anybody that goes spends any time up in the Ojai Oakview area, Lake Casitas. There are a couple of trees there that have pretty good numbers of vultures roosting, particularly mornings or evenings. You can see anywhere from half a dozen to a dozen or more just sitting around in the trees, which again, given their reputation, may be unsettling for some people. I think it's really fascinating to get to see them. When they're together, they tend to be a little less nervous, and so when there's a flock of them starting to settle in, you can usually get reasonably close and just sit quietly and watch them and just watch their interactions. And yeah, they really are quite astoundingly fascinating animals.
There is there are two more questions, and these are highly relevant to conservation of vultures, and so I'd like to spend a moment on these. So Angela asks, how is it that turkey vultures have managed to escape the same threats that have brought down the California condor population? They seem to be so much more, well, they are, as she says, so much more abundant. You want to speak to that for a minute, Paul?
Yeah, well, I think you get kind of at two things. They are more abundant. They're much more widespread. They are simply a much more common bird. They're a little smaller. There's a lot more of them. that's one small part of it. Condors have a very restricted range. I mean, even prehistorically, it seems like they really only lived along the west coast. Now, they inhabited more of it, but they didn't venture particularly far inland. So that's partly just population ecology. There are more turkey vultures because they're more adaptable. Much more interesting, though, what you bring up is that in the early days of the condor reintroductions, they ran into a number of problems. Both species are quite inquisitive, but with the condors that were raised first in captivity became very habituated to people, and they had a variety of problems in the early reintroductions because of that. A lot of the furniture, the perches and the stuff in their early cages as captive birds were made out of old repurposed telephone poles. So they learned to recognize those as perches. When they got back out in the wild, they saw what looked like their old, telephone pole perches, and they were power lines. So they had a lot of electrocutions. They had to do aversion training for that. They were getting into things like used motor oil and used engine coolant. I know that a few of them died early on from getting into places where they could get into toxins like that. And then the really huge one is lead poisoning, which is to this day a big problem with the reintroduced condors, because when hunters hunt with lead ammunition and they either wound an animal and they don't recover it, or if they kill an animal but they gut it and leave the gut pile on site with the lead fragments of the bullets in it, for reasons that I don't think are particularly well understood medically, California condors are much, much more susceptible to lead toxicity than turkey vultures. And everything about that just seems intuitively backwards. Typically, a bigger animal you'd think would have a greater tolerance for a little bit of lead, simply because it's got, there's more animal there. And maybe somebody has looked into this, but if they have, I'm not aware of it. But the condors are much more susceptible to lead toxicity. So a very small amount of lead incapacitates or kills them, where turkey vultures, for whatever reason, seem able to bear a higher load of lead in their bodies. So it's just kind of evolutionary luck of the draw. Turkey vultures, it doesn't seem to affect them as much. So that's another reason.
And then last but not least, there's the microtrash issue, which is that condors have a tendency to pick up and handle lots of little bits and pieces of things, shells, oyster shells, things like that traditionally, and would have fed them to their young. And so they do the same thing with bits and pieces of trash and feed them to their young too in the nest. And then the young birds get impacted and can die from that too. So they do have a host of issues, unfortunately, that are impacting
and again,
them. They also historically ate larger prey, so there has been a historic long-term die-off of the megafauna of the Western United States. And as those have declined, we no longer have camels and, equids, naturally, they're native equids that occur in the Western US. But as those died off, condor populations, we think, also declined because of that, whereas historically turkey vultures always ate smaller prey.
And
so
there's always been lots of it.
Yeah, so there are a number of factors, but certainly that sensitivity to lead is a really big issue. All right, well, I think I'm going to leave it at that, because I think there was just one more comment. Oh, Jennifer did have a question. She said that earlier you had said in your presentation that in the 1800s, research was done testing turkey vulture sense of smell. It was commonly thought that they sought out prey solely by eyesight. She said, maybe I missed this in the presentation, but how did this perception exactly change to us knowing that they're able to smell the scent put by us in natural gas? How was that tested, in other words?
Let's see, you're going to test my memory now a little bit. It's been a while since I read the Vulture's Nostril essay by Noah Stryker, but he goes into this in some detail. He probably has the step-by-step. It's interesting that even at the time when Audubon and Bachman published their works, they were largely excoriated for it by the community. So a lot of people were already pretty well convinced that vultures were finding their food by scent. I think it was just through the 1800s, as more people spent more time looking at them, you know, ornithology became much more widespread, and so I think there were just more accurate observations, and people did a variety of tests of hiding things. I think the problem, I forget whether it was Bachman or Audubon, had actually hidden the food under canvas, and the birds came and walked over the top of it and left again, and they probably had smelled that it was there, but they don't have the tools to tear through canvas, for the same reason that a lot of the old world vultures can't be the first scavenger on a kill, because they don't have the strength to tear into the hides. They have to wait for something like a hyena or something else to tear it open. Likewise here, coyotes, mountain lions, things like that often have to actually do the initial work of tearing open big things. But their experiments were flawed. So I think more people actually sort of figured they had a sense of smell, and they just did, you know, they'd throw dead animals out and put them under a tree so you couldn't actually see them from up above, and vultures would still show up. And so I think it was largely by just by guess and by gosh, sort of informal experiments like that. I'm sure that somebody along the way now has done things with captive reared vultures, putting them in rooms, and
I'm sure,
you know, all of the standard behavioral tests. If they touch the right thing, then they get a food reward. And so if they respond to a smell, you can tell. I mean, who knows? As horrifying as science tended to be in the early 1900s, it's possible that they actually did things like blinded them and showed that they could still find their food. I don't know if there was experimentation like that done, but
there may well have been.
Surprised me.
We have lots of behavioral ways to assess it now, you know, that we can see.
Yeah.
So,
but then the kind of the final straw was when they started putting mercaptan in natural gas, and the vultures started you know, hovering around pipelines. That was, I think his name was Steckbridge, something like that. It was only in the 70s or 80s that this guy actually finally put all the pieces together with Union Oil Company and said, you know, well, of course they have a sense of smell. Look what they're doing. They're, you know, the guys always come back and say the vultures were flying around the pipeline. When we went where they were flying, there was a leak. It's like, gee, what? You suppose they saw the gas leak, or do you think they smelled it?
And I think they do use them to help identify where gas leaks are now.
Yeah. Apparently they'll go out and do helicopter surveys of gas lines now and
look for turkey vultures.
Yeah.
So okay, so I think we have one last question. There seem to be a lot of questions. How do turkey vultures communicate with each other, since they really don't have a voice or call? Do you want to handle that, Paul, or would you like me to?
Well, so yeah, you're absolutely right. They don't have any sort of an actual vocal mechanism. They don't have a syrinx. They can, however, they can grunt, they can hiss, they can make a variety of sort of percussive sounds. And so if you watch a bunch of turkey vultures at a carcass, there's definitely a hierarchy and a pecking order, and they make that known both through, you know, grunting and hissing. If a turkey vulture jumps at you going and batting its wings, it's a pretty good sign that it doesn't want you there. And that's what they do to each other. And so they grunt and a lot of physical stuff. They'll shake their wings, they'll charge while making a variety of guttural noises. So they are capable of making sounds that without saying the words are you know, pretty clearly communicating, I'm superior to you, you have to get away now, and I'll eat first and you can come and eat later.
And then if you're wondering how do they tell each other when it's time to go, or something like that, you know, time to fly away from a site or away from a carcass, well, one will launch into the air, oftentimes, you know, maybe an older bird, but once the bird is up, that communicates a lot. You know, it's time to go. They're enormous birds, and when one takes off of the ground and it's got a 9.5-foot wingspan, others notice.
And
hard to get lost.
Yeah, well, that's another another form of communication that is believed to be active with them. And actually that the fictional piece that I read sort of gets at it, where the vultures all go back to the roost. And so the one who doesn't want to alert the others to the fact that he has spotted something, he says, okay, so I'm just going to go back and sort of pretend to be asleep. And when the rest of them fall asleep, I'm going to sneak back and get the dead armadillo for myself. Well, they do. That's one of the theories for why they roost in numbers the way they do, is that dead animals are not common. They're spread widely on the ground. And so when you see vultures out soaring, I always say if I could fly, I'd just go fly around for the fun of it. But they're actually up there doing, they're working, they're looking for food. And typically when one vulture spots food, they're curious, but they also aren't particularly bold birds. So one vulture will rarely come to a carcass by itself. It doesn't feel very confident doing that. So at least theoretically, when it spots food, it will circle. And the idea is that other vultures from miles away, when they see that, they will converge. That's sort of vulture speak.
It's a signal.
Or there's something interesting here, we better all get together and see. And once enough vultures kind of get together that they start to feel a little more confident, then they will go to ground, and one of the braver ones will go up and check it out. And so they're communicating completely non-verbally in that case, but they're working separately, but they're at the same time they're kind of working together. They're keeping an eye on what the other ones are doing, and if one finds something, the others will be called in to come and help bolster numbers. So you don't have to talk to communicate, it turns out.
You don't have to have a cell phone.
Right.
You don't have to have a cell phone to communicate. Amazing. Or a computer. Okay, so I think let's leave it at that. I'll just thank everybody for participating and for sticking with us to the end of the presentation tonight, and for all of your good questions. Thank you so much. Of course, I didn't say anything, neither did Paul, about the pandemic and about the challenge of these times, but we of course wish that you and your families and loved ones are doing as well as possible. We wish you safety and good health and some positivity in your life, and I hope you have some opportunity to enjoy the autumn weather, which is starting, and I hope that it stays cool and nice and fire free as much as possible for wherever you are. But thank you again very much for joining. Thank you, Paul, for the presentation. And we'll see all of you next month. If you check back on our website and through Facebook and Instagram, you'll be able to see what the presentation will be about next month. We should be announcing that within the next 10 days or so. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm gonna sign off.
Good night.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.